Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. The trial to remove President Donald Trump has begun, but how does it end? Let's get to the bottom line. For only the third time in the history of America, the President of the United States will face trial by the legislative branch of government. According to Democrats, what's at stake is the rule of law and the future of democracy. According to many Republicans, who hold a majority of the U.S. Senate, this is a wasteful and divisive charade, or to quote President Trump, a hoax. Now, as the Senate turns into a big courtroom, the big question is, does the president have the right to push other countries, in this case Ukraine, to do his bidding? Wait a minute. Every president does that sort of thing. The real question is whether it is an abuse of power to push a foreign country to investigate his political rival. And did President Donald Trump wipe out the power of Congress by blocking evidence and testimony during the impeachment investigation last year? So what's next in the drama of 100 senators and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court all presiding over all this? Will this trial just go through the motions, or should we expect some surprises along the way? Fortunately, we have three people in the room who have all the answers. Jason Miller, co-host of the daily podcast War Room Impeachment, and former spokesman for the 2016 Trump campaign. Hillary Hurd, contributor for the Lawfare blog, who's wrapping up her law degree at Harvard University. Good luck with that. And finally, Richard Goodstein, an attorney and a Democratic strategist here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sure this is going to be a fun show, and I'm sure we would like to go on for hours on this topic, but we've got some limited time today. But, Jason, I want to just have you help us set the stage, because I know that you have been one of the people calling this impeachment process somewhat of a farce, somewhat inappropriate. But set the stage for the history of this moment. And do you find it a historic moment yourself?
Well, it's a historic moment that I think ultimately on the political side will be good for President Trump, but I think this is terrible for the country, and I think for what it sets up for impeachment in years going forward. So for our international friends, I think what's important to realize is that there's a 0% chance that President Trump is going to be removed from office. And what we're seeing here with impeachment is, just as some of the founders with Madison and Hamilton wrote, that whatever party controls whichever house of Congress ultimately leads to where the votes are going to be. The only bipartisan vote that there's been in this process has been against these two articles of impeachment. So I'm one who's very much believed that this is an impeachment witch hunt, as I've called it, as President Trump has called it. And I'm actually one from the Republican side who supports President Trump, who would like to see a more robust, thorough trial, because I don't think the Democrats will stop with this impeachment effort. I think they're going to continue with other impeachment efforts in the future. And it's only until we go through and truly snuff out and flesh out all of these arguments and really the foreign policy disagreement that started this, that we're ever going to reach some kind of consensus in this country.
Well, part of this, Jason, is a trial, and part of it is a comment on what red lines the President of the United States should not go across. And I know you know the President. I know that you've been around him and you've seen this. And I think part of the question that people have, who are just thoughtful, knowledgeable, may not know every bit of the legal game going on, but they worry that the President of the United States may not know that there are lines you shouldn't cross. That may not, reach the level of impeaching him and removing from office. But are there red lines that people of your view believe exist on the President, or can the President virtually do anything?
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I would say that for all of the rhetoric and the things that have gone back and forth, unity and substance have really been the two messages that we've seen from President Trump. Unity in keeping Republicans together, and then substance as far as go through and read the transcript, take a look at it. In fact, the two best fact witnesses, I believe, for President Trump are Ukrainian President Zelensky and his foreign minister, who both have said that there was no quid pro quo or any of that. And for all of the allegations that have been thrown out there, things like extortion, things like bribery, some pretty scurrilous charges against President Trump, those were all left on the cutting room floor over in the House of Representatives. Those aren't in these articles of impeachment. And so the bottom line from the pro-Trump side is that there is no crime here. There's nothing at all improper with what President Trump did in this.
Richard, is there a crime here? When you look at the facts that have laid out, and I'm just listening to Jason very carefully, one of the interesting things about this particular case and episode of The Call is that much of our knowledge of it has come through other Republicans, other members of the president's team, not just a whistleblower, but any number of people who said this was not there. In your mind, do you think the president committed impeachable offenses here? Do you believe there's a crime?
Yeah, so I don't think there's any question. Yes, and my sources, again, are Republicans. The Government Accounting Office just last week said that what the president did was against the law. And I would ask, this notion, this is one of the bigger misdirections, the Constitution doesn't list this as a crime, is crazy. If you talk to every constitutional scholar, Jason says this is bad for the country. Let me tell you what I think the public thinks is bad for the country. The public thinks it's bad for the country if the president can put the arm on a foreign leader and say, hey, do me this favor before I relinquish this aid. Incidentally, even though the fact that you have people being killed on the front lines, I'm going to hold back until you do me this favor. And the favor is not actually launching an investigation. It's merely announcing an investigation. So this notion that he was trying to root out corruption, somebody who was surrounded by people who were now in jail during his campaign, the notion that he, who never was heard to talk about corruption anywhere else on the planet, was somehow or other that he was trying to root out corruption in Ukraine is fanciful and farcical. And yet people can say it with a straight face, so the Trump base can hear it and go, yeah, I believe that. It's nonsense when, again, all he wanted was an announcement. And the good thing is Joe Biden's actually benefiting. The very person he was trying to hurt is benefiting. He alone is in Iowa now.
Richard, you know that there are a lot of Americans who see it the other way. I mean, what's fascinating is to watching the polling every week on this shift. You know, one week it's 51% of Americans want to see the president impeached and convicted and removed from office. And now this week, it's the other way around. This week, there was a new Gallup poll that shows just today that 51% of Americans do not want to see the president convicted and impeached and removed. And so you've got this kind of interesting slide back and forth in the middle. I'm often wondering whether people of great passion and conviction can understand why there are people out there who don't agree with you.
Well, that's kind of almost a philosophical question, right? But I would point to the CNN poll this morning. 51% said, yes, they favor conviction and removal. 45% no, which means there are people who voted for Donald Trump who actually think he should be removed from office. And 69% of the people in that poll said there should be witnesses. 48% of Republicans said yes on witnesses versus 44 no. So the public, I think, over time, Nancy Pelosi played this just right. The fact that we've had this passage of time since the House impeached has all worked to the benefit of the position that the House managers are trying to
Hillary,
bring forward.
you write about law. I mean, it's just, as a journalist myself, I couldn't imagine anything that would probably get fewer readers, but now you're in the hot spot, right? You're writing about law. What are your North Stars in sort of telling the story of what equities matter in an impeachment of a president? What are the pieces that we should be looking at as we watch this? We're only going to see this, 100 senators sitting up there. I've sat on the Senate floor before. It's a solemn and interesting place. You feel the power of the history of the United States there in everything. But this is a serious deal, the Chief Justice of the United States. So as you write about this, what are the pieces you look for?
Yeah, well, I think to answer that question, we have to also think about what are the legal questions that are distractions.
Right.
And I think in the context of impeachment, there's been a common argument that there needs to be a crime committed in order to impeach a president of the United States. That was featured very prominently in the president's trial memorandum over the weekend. And the fact is that of all the impeachments in the United States history, there have been 20 altogether, 1/3 of them involved no criminal offense at all. And second of all, of Trump's own legal team, there appears to be some disagreement about this very question. So Dershowitz over the weekend has been on TV.
Yeah, Alan Dershowitz, who's one of the president's team, who was also had commented on the Clinton impeachment before and made the comment that there need not be a crime.
Right.
There needs to be a preponderance of corruption and other issues.
Right.
But now what is he saying?
Right. So he's one of the recent additions, and he sort of had to walk back some of his comments over the weekend because some people took him to be saying what Trump has been saying, that there doesn't need to be, or that there needs to be a criminal offense committed. And Dershowitz has actually had to walk back and say, actually, no, that isn't really the case, because he had written that before, and that's among the constitutional law scholars is the predominant view. And what's somewhat odd, I would argue, about the Trump trial memorandum is that they say this has always been true in the case of presidential impeachments. They try to draw this distinction from judges who've been impeached.
Right.
But the fact is that even President Johnson, the 11th article of impeachment against President Johnson was for yelling at Congress, for being rude to Congress. And that was certainly not an indictable offense at the time, and it's not an indictable offense now.
So what are the other distractions that you see out there? Because one of the other topics that's come a lot is the issue of witnesses.
Yeah. Well, so I think that there are right now two competing philosophies about what the job of the Senate is. We have on the Republican side this argument put forward most prominently perhaps by Marco Rubio, who's saying, it's the job of the Senate to review the House's homework. We're going to give it a grade. A is removal, and then F is acquittal. And that's all we're going to do. We're almost like an appellate court, if you will. And then you have Democrats, on the other hand, saying, sure, review our work with 600 pages, it's pretty significant, but we also think that you should do some of your own investigating. You have the powers at your disposal to compel witnesses. You have the powers at your disposal to subpoena documents, and you should do that, especially in this case when you have individuals like John Bolton, who was a former national security advisor to the president, who is saying that he knows something new. And especially in this case when, looking at all prior impeachments, the Senate has always called witnesses. So this appears to be the tension between the two. The idea of how much investigating is the Senate going to do, is that is really its proper role, and to the extent that it is its proper role, who should be called?
Jason, are you opposed to witnesses? Are you opposed to these witnesses being called later in the trial? Lev Parnas, Mick Mulvaney, John Bolton, who said he'd be willing to testify. And is that a distraction, as you see it, from the argument about the kind of core direction that the impeachment trial is taking?
Well, not at all. And to restate what I said in the opening, there's 0% chance that President Trump is removed here.
Right.
And so really what this becomes is where are the political pressures going to be put, and can Speaker Pelosi and now into Chuck Schumer and Senate Democrats go and delay this process to create more political pain for President Trump? I take a counterintuitive approach on this.
Is he in more pain from this? Because it seems to me that early on, the president kept saying, impeach me, I dare you to impeach me. And Nancy, the speaker, was basically saying, no, we're trying to delay the speaker. Nancy Pelosi was trying to sort of delay this process from beginning because I think she had concerns about how this would play in a big section of the country. Just talking politics for a minute. Didn't the president egg them on?
Politically speaking, this has motivated his base. And so going into the 2018 elections where Democrats were at a 10 out of 10 in motivational intensity, Republicans were way off, where maybe a 6 or 7 out of 10. Now Republicans have caught up, and they're motivated in this election. But let me go to the trial issue on witnesses, because I have a bit of a counterintuitive approach. What this ultimately started with was a foreign policy disagreement with this so-called whistleblower who didn't like the public policy direction of where President Trump was going. He's trying to tip over the apple cart and reset the world order and take a different perspective. People forget Ukraine just recently was the #1 most corrupt country in the entire world. They've improved now. They're up to #3. And even in that language that Congress votes on every year, it's called the National Defense Authorization Act. There's language in there that says all U.S. aid going to Ukraine should be tied to their improvements on anti-corruption efforts. But let me go to the trial for a moment, because this is different from what most Republicans are saying. I think we absolutely have to have a full trial, bring in all these witnesses. And so when we talk about the witnesses, let's bring in Lev Parnas. Let's bring in President Zelensky from Ukraine. He said there's no quid pro quo. He didn't feel any pressure. He can Skype. We have pretty good technology now, so I'm not expecting him to fly over here. Let's bring in the foreign minister. Let's bring in Adam Schiff, who's one of the House impeachment managers, who I think is actually a fact witness in this. And you know what? I'm absolutely fine if book deal Bolton, John Bolton, who, by the way, is drumming this up
because deal Bolton.
He wants to sell books. Do you think John Bolton, I'm not worried about John Bolton being a witness. I'm not worried about anybody being a witness, because I don't think President Trump did anything wrong. But until we get to this root cause, until we bring in the whistleblower to hold them publicly accountable for starting this entire impeachment mess, which, by the way, the Whistleblower Act does not grant you anonymity in any way, shape, or form. Right. It's in cases of waste or fraud to make sure that somebody doesn't get fired.
But Jason,
but do you understand?
I ask just genuinely, when you've got characters in there like Mayor, Giuliani and Lev Parnas, whom we've heard a lot from in the last few days, very colorful.
St. Lev, the media is starting the beatification process. It's just fascinating.
I can't wait till the musical on Broadway comes out with these various characters. It'll be our version of that. But does this not give you and many of the people that agree with your perspective some pause? That when you think it's a different foreign policy or not, but clearly the Biden piece of this was important. Hunter Biden was on the board of Burisma. A lot of people, both Democrats and Republicans, said, hey, there's something not right in Denmark on this. But I think at the same time, how do you square the Giuliani role?
I think Mayor Giuliani, look, the evidence that's been put forward actually vindicates him in this effort. It's exculpatory. You take a look at the Lev Parnas communications where Rudy is telling President Zelensky, or wanting to communicate a message of President Zelensky to quit being a boy, be a man, go and split your ties with this oligarch and crack down on corruption. So I think the evidence is actually good for Rudy. But Steve, do you understand my point that I think that we have to get to the bottom of these foreign policy disagreements, that if a president is elected in the United States, they should have people around them who agree with their worldview, what they're trying to do. But all that evidence, all the Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, whistleblower 1, whistleblower 2, they've all disappeared. And now it's simply about process, which I thought House Democrats didn't care about process.
Richard?
If I may.
Yeah.
Two things. First, if the whistleblower fell off the face of the earth and every word that whistleblower wrote disappeared, it would have zero bearing on what the House did and what the Senate trial should entail. We all know that the whistleblower was not a first-hand witness other than listening into the call, and we have this so-called transcript of the call. And this whole notion of a public policy distinction, Steve, is a myth. It's a joke. Because every stitch of evidence points to one thing. All Donald Trump wanted was an announcement of an investigation. There was zero evidence, zero, that he wanted an actual investigation. All he wanted from people who were involved, including his own ambassador, handpicked, said, no, all he wanted was an announcement. So this talk about that it was a public policy difference is really, sorry, a joke. It's just untrue. It's baseless. There's no evidence to support it.
Hillary?
I think just to add two more facts on the table that could affect your calculus about what should happen next. The first is that in the call with President Zelensky, in the transcript that we have, the word corruption, which is presumably the Trump argument for why he was calling Zelensky, is not used at all. It's not used at all. And so I think to find out whether there is any plausibility behind this defense, that the president was really seeking to root out corruption in Ukraine, we would need to speak with the closer advisors to the president. And unfortunately, the president has said that for national security reasons, none of those individuals can speak to Congress. And so I think it would be great, to your argument, that wouldn't it be wonderful to have everyone under the sun with any connection to this story testify before the Senate and have a real trial. But the fact of the matter is that the President of the United States has refused to let any one of his close associates, those best placed to actually tell us whether it was about corruption, speak.
So let me ask you all three this question, because I think as we watch this drama unfold, one of the questions we've had so many people preposition their views before evidence had been provided. We have Mitch McConnell. I was with Senator Lindsey Graham recently, and Lindsey Graham called me biased. I've already made my decision. I don't want to hear or see the evidence. And there's been a lot made of the fact that this violates the oath that these 100 senators took with the Chief Justice of the United States to remain unbiased to do this. Is this, I probably agree with Jason that you're not going to see the removal of office, but what's being strengthened in democracy by this process, or what's being weakened when they see the kind of characters and statements come out that are so disrespectful, fundamentally a part of the process? Hillary?
When you have to swear before the country that you're going to do an oath of impartial justice in the trial of the president, which, as Republicans admit, is an incredibly significant commitment, and it's an incredibly significant event to be happening, the third time in American history, then I would have to think that making that oath, you're also pledging not to put your own political calculations at the forefront. Of course, every senator is thinking about re-election. Republicans are thinking about that. Democrats are thinking about that. But I think there's an argument inherent in the oath that you're supposed to extend beyond. You're supposed to look at the facts that you have, and to the extent that you don't have facts, you're supposed to find out a way to get them. That's why the Senate has the power to compel witnesses and to subpoena documents.
Jason, if you were the spokesperson involved in this, advising people, are you comfortable with what you've heard senators on both sides of the aisle come out and preposition themselves on this process?
Well, I think I have a much different take than many of the senators, and that I want to get to the bottom of this, because I do not think this will be the last impeachment push for President Trump. I think we've already seen this from court filings. This isn't just a Jason speculation thing. We've seen House Democrats already go and file things in court filings saying that they are going to be pursuing additional impeachment efforts, or in the process of that, whether it's having to do with executive privilege and with Don McGahn going back to the Russia hoax, or even currently with the whole impeachment witch hunt, or in the future, I wouldn't be surprised if Democrats went after President Trump for the Soleimani strike and all the issues there that he's gone to with trying to keep America safe. So I don't think this is ever going to end. And going back a moment, when we saw some of these witnesses come forward, there was this compelling narrative of our policy, And so we'd see this from whether it be Hill, or we'd see this from Vindman, or we'd see this from several of the folks who came through and testified. There's, for many in the national security space, there's a belief that there's what President Trump believes on policy, and then there's our policy, U.S. policy, the traditional policy of the last 10, 20, 30 years. That's really at the crux of this current impeachment debate. Is a lot of folks don't think that President Trump should have the right to pursue his foreign policy the way that he wants to. So politically speaking, again, I think this will boost President Trump, but I think it's the fact that it's basically whoever has more seats in the Senate, just like whoever had more seats in the House, will determine if this is a real impeachment or not. I think is bad for the country. It's exactly like I said earlier, what Madison and Hamilton were worried about.
Richard, when you heard the names Ken Starr and Alan Dershowitz and other members of the legal team announced, what went through your mind? And for the audience, Ken Starr, of course, these are celebrity attorneys, and they both have been brought on. Alan Dershowitz, somewhat reluctantly, it seemed at the beginning. But these are two people who were involved and commenting and played a direct role in Clinton's impeachment 20 years ago, and now are tasked with sort of arguing the opposite of what they argued with Clinton. I'm just sort of interested in your take.
Look, Ken Starr, Robert Ray, who succeeded him, have been brought on over the past several months, supposedly as like independent voices, giving history and commentary. And I think they've been revealed to be political hacks, which is what we knew Ken Starr to be, frankly, back during the Monica Lewinsky time, the way he kind of, took her aside and practically put her under arrest because she wouldn't basically disclose what he wanted her to disclose,
right,
which didn't actually comport with what the truth was. So I actually think in an odd, look, Bill Clinton ended up with that impeachment trial at 70% approval after the impeachment trial. And Donald Trump,
the same thing happened with President
Donald
Trump
today is at 43, okay? And he's been kind of in the low 40s the whole time with an economy that's doing
those numbers
pretty well.
Have been impervious to the impeachment. They've been there at that level for a long time, whether there's been impeachment or not.
What's gone? That's true. It hasn't hurt him,
right,
but the economy certainly hasn't helped him. And I would just wonder. Look, there will not be any witnesses. Let's not kid ourselves, because there's nobody who has anything exculpatory that helps Donald Trump. And I guarantee you, I would bet my reputation and whatever I'm worth that there will be no witnesses because they can't. Yes.
So in our last 5 minutes, Richard, would you find President Trump weakened or strengthened? You believe in this process?
I think he will be weakened because his base is there. The people who voted for him in 2016 and abandoned Republicans in droves in 2018 were suburban, largely well-educated women. They will look at this and be nauseated, as they have been all along, by grabbing people by the crotch and so forth. This will be more of that, and that's not who they're going to get.
Jason, strengthened or weakened the president as a result of this impeachment trial?
I think ultimately his base is going to be more fired up and much more motivated as we go into the presidential year. But I think this does step on a lot of his great recent successes. The phase 1 of the China deal, USMCA, the North America Trade Agreement redo that they did. I think it does step on that. And again, I think it's bad for the country overall, because it's showing just how political this entire process has become. And let's not kid ourselves. Whoever's the next president, Republican or Democrat, probably going to get impeached too. This is now setting up the new normal of where impeachment is basically just a turn of phrase by political opponents.
Thank you. Hillary, final word.
Well, I try to avoid making political predictions, but one thing seems clear, and that is the legal arguments that the Trump team has put forward are ambitious, original, and a stretch in some ways. And so the Trump administration is asking his fellow Republicans to come along with him for that sort of far-out legal ride, and to defend a policy decision, perhaps, that is not so clearly about policy.
Right.
And so by asking that, it's not clear within the long term how this will impact the Republican Party. It's just a big ask.
Well, thank you. I thought a thoughtful conversation on this topic would be impossible. We've had it, and I want to thank my panel. I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Republican strategist Jason Miller, Lawfare blog contributor Hillary Hurd, and Democratic strategist Richard Goodstein. Thank you all very much for, I thought, a fantastic discussion. We've got to come back and see how this plays out over time. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? Whether people celebrate the irreverent and pugnacious style of President Trump or just can't stand him, putting a president on trial is a hugely serious moment. This is not a hoax, and it's not a charade. It's possible to find the president's behavior awful, but still not enough to convict him and remove him from office. Some, like Jason Miller on my panel, argue that everything Trump did was inside the line of the president's power and was just A-OK. But others, about half of the U.S. voting population, believe that he is guilty of impeachable offenses and should be removed. I don't see any surprises ahead. President Trump is likely to remain President Trump for a while, at least until the 2020 election and even after, if he's reelected. But this historic trial is a lesson in democracy. We are seeing a branch of government fight back against the president who doesn't want to be controlled or constrained. We are seeing checks and balances in play, and that is a good thing. And that's the bottom line.